You are listening to the Stave Off Podcast, the podcast that gives you the information you need to stave off illness and injuries, letting you live a happy life. And now your hosts, Nick and Christina.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Stave Off Podcast. I'm Christina Novak. I will be your host for today. Usually I'm with my co-host, Nick Previtt, but it seems like over the last couple of episodes, we've been missing each other. You'd think that because, we're getting married and we own a business together that we would be together all the time. But Nick actually has a couple of friends who are visiting him from Thunder Bay. And so they kind of have a boys' weekend going on. And so he's kind of MIA, but that is okay. We can totally have this discussion and maybe we can get him to have some comments or something after. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've been kind of under the weather for the last couple of days and I sound way worse than I feel. But if I'm sounding a little sick, that is why. And then I also have the dogs with me, which right now are being quiet, but I can't promise that that is going to be the case the entire time through this podcast. So if you hear any barks and whimpers, that's usually our black lab who is trying to get outside because he wants to go gallivant away in the backyard over the weekend. So, all right. My preamble is done. What we're going to talk about today is heart disease. I called heart disease the silent killer because often we can have a diagnosis of heart disease and not know it. We have certain risk factors that we're going to talk about a little bit later on that can kind of give us an idea, but it isn't usually until the heart disease is relatively advanced that we start to see some of the symptoms of heart disease developing. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through with different definitions and things like that. I thought that I would start with just some basic anatomy of the heart. Super, super simple. I love doing these podcasts because I end up going over stuff again that I learned in school and keeping kind of on my toes and up to date with some of the research and things that are going on in the field. So it's really great for me too. So the anatomy of the heart. So obviously it's in our chest. We have arteries and veins that are bringing in blood that's full of oxygen and blood that is not full of oxygen. We have two sides to the heart. We have the left side and the right side. The right side is bringing blood that does not have as much oxygen in it. And then it's pumping out of the heart into the lungs. And the lungs are filling it with oxygen. Once the blood has been filled with oxygen, it comes back into the heart through the left side of the heart and then pumps out through the aorta to the rest of the body. The pumping part of the heart is what creates our blood pressure. We talked about blood pressure in some of our frequently asked question videos on the website. And the heart pumping and the pressure that's against the arteries is going to dictate our blood pressure. And it's why it's super important. And we'll talk about it a little bit more as we keep going through the podcast. Our blood pressure is our systolic blood pressure. So the top number, if we're thinking that blood pressure is 120 over 80, the 120 is our systolic blood pressure. And that is the pressure that is against the arteries around the heart and around the body as the heart beats. The diastolic blood pressure, which is the second number, is the pressure against the arteries as the heart relaxes. And I think that makes sense. Where if we're having pressure from the heart pumping, it's going to be pushing more blood. So it's going to be pushing more against the outside walls of the arteries. And so the pressure is going to be higher than when the heart is relaxed and we don't have the same amount of blood being pushed against the walls. And therefore, there's a difference between our systolic blood pressure and our diastolic blood pressure. And this all becomes really important when it comes to our diagnosis of heart disease. Heart disease is a narrowing of the vessels around the heart by plaques. I'm going to try and pronounce the word, but I always get it wrong. Atherosclerotic plaques. And this can develop over time and is related to a lot of different things in our lifestyle, which we will talk about. When we talk about these plaques, they don't have to only develop in the vessels around the heart. They actually just have different names depending on where the narrowing or where the eventual full blockage develops. Heart disease or a heart attack happens because there is a blockage in the arteries coming around and the vessels coming around the heart. If we have something called peripheral vascular disease, that generally happens when we have a narrowing around some of the vessels that are in the legs or in the periphery, more commonly in the legs. A stroke is essentially the exact same mechanism, but instead of the vessels around the heart, it's the vessel going into the brain, and it can affect the blood flow there. And as I've mentioned, I called this episode The Silent Killer because these plaques can develop over a long period of time. Some is I don't know if some would be normal, actually. As I'm saying that, I'm second guessing myself. I wonder if you could go through your entire life with no atherosclerotic plaque. That is a good question. But it tends to develop over a lifetime. And that is usually the reason why people will develop angina, which is kind of a chest pain that comes from that narrowing as it develops. Also, heart attack and stroke. So the Heart and Stroke Foundation talks about this a lot, and that's the narrowing that comes to a complete blockage for a heart attack, the vessels of the heart, or in a stroke, the vessels around the brain. And the craziest statistics that I ever saw with this was that 80% of premature heart attacks and strokes could have been prevented. 80%. Like, that to me is just the craziest thing ever. And so I thought I would talk about some of the risk factors and then what we can start to do to try and avoid heart disease from developing, slow down the progression of heart disease if it's already established, or improve outcomes for people who have already had either heart attack or stroke or a stent put in, some sort of heart surgery related to heart disease. All right, so we are going to talk about first some of these risk factors. And another crazy stat, again from the Heart and Stroke Foundation, is that 9 out of 10 Canadians have at least one of these risk factors. 90%. That to me was crazy. That blew my mind when I was reading these statistics as I was preparing for this podcast. So 80% of heart attacks and strokes that are premature could be prevented, and 9 out of 10 of us have some of these risk factors. It's so mind-boggling. So we'll get into it. Okay, so risk factors, I'm going to list them out, and then we can talk a little bit more about each one. An unhealthy diet, not getting enough exercise, having too much weight on us, smoking, too high stress, too much alcohol, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes. A lot of these I'm pretty sure we all know can be risk factors, but I thought that we would go over each of them and just talk about some of the things that we can do and why these impact the heart so much. All right, let's talk first about our diet. So this is an area that is very quickly developing, and there's a lot of debate right now in the research about, because we're going to tie that into cholesterol, about, are saturated fats good or bad? Is it really refined sugar that's causing this increase in cholesterol? Is it a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B? And I tend to fall somewhere in the middle. Do I recommend having bacon all the time that's super high in saturated fats? No. Do I think that it's better if we have a primarily plant-based diet and limit our refined sugar? Absolutely. Do I feel like moderation is the spice of life? Completely. But overall, having a healthier diet that's rich in fruits and vegetables, are filled with lean proteins that can come from an animal source or a vegetarian or vegan source is going to help, because we want to think that our foods affect a lot of our processes in our body. They're what give us nourishment, and they can affect us in a positive or a negative way. I feel like inflammatory foods has become this kind of buzzword, but we do see that we have inflammatory properties to different foods and anti-inflammatory properties to other foods. And so trying to keep a diet rich in the anti-inflammatory foods and moderation for the pro-inflammatory foods is going to be really important. The next one is physical activity. When we are active, we are keeping our heart healthy. Our heart is a muscle, and so we need to use it or lose it. But obviously you're not going to lose your heart, but I mean keeping it healthy. We want to use it so that we are in tip-top shape. And as we are doing, especially cardio, well, I shouldn't even say that. Strength training helps too. But it can actually help to exercise has been shown to slow down or even potentially reverse some of the plaques that have developed around the arteries in the heart. And so it's a really important part for management. Cardiac rehabilitation, which people can be enrolled in after they've had a heart attack or heart surgery, has exercise at its core. And the reason why is because of all of the benefits around cardiac rehab and how important it is for us to not only get back to where we were before we had surgery or before we had a heart attack, but also because of how important it is to make sure that nothing else happens, that we keep our heart nice and healthy. Our weight. So another statistic, this is a Canadian statistic, but I'm pretty sure it's very close in the US, and I'm not sure about the rest of the world. But over 60% of Canadian adults are either overweight or obese. For people who are overweight, we have 2 times the risk of heart disease. And the reason for that is because we tend to be in a higher inflammatory state if we have extra weight on us. It's also putting more, if we're heavier, we have more of our body to supply with blood. So our heart is working harder. And so, and then there's a whole bunch of other linkages and things that can come into play. Smoking is another one. So we've gone over diet, obviously super important. Exercise, again, super, super important. Kind of my PhD area. Awesome. Our weight, about how important the weight can be. Smoking. What we've actually figured out with smoking is that it contributes to the plaque buildup. It actually causes it to happen faster. And so people who smoke are at higher risk of heart disease and issues with heart attack because of that acceleration. But for people who are smokers, I don't know if there's any one who does smoke, I can totally empathize with how hard it can be to quit smoking. And so talking to a doctor or finding some support system or some smoking cessation aid that's going to help you, if you're kind of in that step where you realize you need to quit, but you're not sure exactly how to do it, talking to someone or talking to your doctor or anything is something that's going to be really beneficial. My parents were long-term smokers and they've quit for a couple of years now, but I saw just how hard it was. And my dad, he's quit for a couple of years. He still says, especially when I'm stressed out, I still want that cigarette. And like going past someone who smokes, you kind of get that pang. So it's something that's really, really hard to do. All right, stress. Stress is a huge risk factor. We see the stories coming into the news around high-end execs or people who have high-stress jobs having heart attacks or suddenly keeling over from a heart attack, and that is usually contributed to stress. A busy lifestyle can also make it harder to adhere to some of these healthy lifestyle decisions, but the thing with stress is that it can increase our blood pressure. When our stress level is high, our body is in that fight or flight response. And so our blood pressure tends to be higher to try and shunt blood to the muscles to get ready to fight from an evolutionary perspective. But when we're not in that type of situation and we're just stressed out from work or from family or from relationships or from whatever is going on in your life, we see that increase in blood pressure and cholesterol, and that can really impact our risk for heart disease. All right, alcohol. This one's always really interesting because actually small to moderate amounts of alcohol are good for you. But when that goes into what is classified as binge drinking, so that's over 4 drinks in one sitting, or too much alcohol consistently over time, it increases your risk for heart disease. So those are kind of the ones that we talked about, those are the ones that are based on healthy lifestyle decisions. So if we think about those ones, like our diet is kind of within our control. It's a lifestyle choice that we make around our diet, exercise, our weight in general. Obviously, there's going to be some circumstances where the weight is secondary to something else. And we've talked about that a little bit in other podcasts on, thyroid function and all that type of thing. But in general, smoking, stress. Some people may tell me that they can't control their stress, but we can definitely be working on tactics such as mindfulness, and obviously exercise helps to try and reduce our body's reaction to stress and try and mitigate some of the negative effects that stress can have on our body, even if sometimes we can't change the circumstances that are causing the stress in the first place. And then obviously alcohol consumption too, that is something within our control. So I would say that those 6 are those healthy lifestyle choices that have a huge influence on our risk for heart disease. The next 3, the high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes, those are kind of consequences of those healthy lifestyle choices. And these ones, especially the high blood pressure and the high cholesterol, it's interesting because as I was going through some of my research studies, and I talked to a lot of people who come into the clinic who are kind of in their 60s and their 70s. I feel like it's almost become very normal for people to be on hypertensive medications, so high blood pressure medications and cholesterol meds. And I don't know what I think about that. Sometimes I think that that's a bad thing. We've almost normalized it because it's so common. But at the same time, these medications are extremely helpful for reducing incidence of heart disease and making sure that those heart attacks and strokes don't happen in the first place. But I know I'm starting to see a lot of people who don't want to be on them, and they realize that they can avoid it altogether by, changing some of their lifestyle decisions. And so it's a really nice shift that I'm starting to see. And I think we need to continue to encourage it. Any medication that you're on is going to have its side effects, and it doesn't just work on one area. It's taken into the body and can work on multiple areas. So that's why those side effects occur. And so if we can mitigate that by, changing our lifestyle and not needing those medications in the first place, I think that is the best medicine. Okay, so blood pressure. We've talked a little bit about that. I talked about why it's important. If you were thinking about the plaques coming into the arteries around the heart, what that does is it makes the walls of the arteries more stiff. Therefore, when the heart pumps, it has to push harder against the wall, or it does because there's less space. There's more pressure that develops. And that can create an increase in our systolic blood pressure, that first number. Therefore, people with high blood pressure may actually have some heart disease going on, and they don't realize it because they're calling it high blood pressure, but the high blood pressure is actually a consequence of the increased pressure that's happening in the system because of this plaque development. And so high blood pressure is a risk factor, but sometimes it's also a consequence of the heart disease happening in the first place. And so high blood pressure is definitely a risk factor. Some of the other lifestyle choices that we talked about, helping with stress and exercising and our diet, all of those things can actually help to reduce our blood pressure so that we can reduce that risk. People who have high blood pressure tend to have heart disease. And so there's kind of that link between the two. Cholesterol is the second one. So high cholesterol, there actually are no symptoms to having high cholesterol, but it does contribute to the hardening of the arteries. Because of the way that the chemical of cholesterol is, like the way that it's structured, it actually doesn't dissolve into the blood, and therefore it contributes to the hardening of the arteries, which is why people, when we go to our doctors, they take do a blood sample and they check for our level of good cholesterol and our level of bad cholesterol, which I feel like is its whole, is a podcast episode all in and of itself. But our low density lipoprotein cholesterol, so our LDL cholesterol, is our bad cholesterol. And our high density lipoprotein, or our HDL cholesterol, is our good cholesterol. So we want a higher level of HDL, a lower level of LDL. And that's going to be largely determined by our diet. And that's the whole debate around, is it saturated fats? Do we need more polyunsaturated fats in our diet? Do we just need to reduce our refined sugars and that'll affect it? And jury's still out about that, but generally, plant-based diets will help with the cholesterol piece. So you see, as we're talking about blood pressure, we're talking about cholesterol, it's often consequences of some of those first risk factors that we were talking about that relate to some of the choices we make day in and day out with lifestyle. All right, the last risk factor that I'm going to talk about today when it comes to heart disease is diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is obviously something that we're born with, and it's because our body isn't producing insulin. That is something that we can't control, but regulating our blood sugar is definitely something we can really focus on. For type 2 diabetes, that is something that is generally developed over time and is relating to insulin resistance, and again, could be its own podcast. But basically, people with diabetes, because of the effect of higher sugar in our bloodstream, it actually affects the integrity of the vessels around our heart and throughout our body, which is why we tend to have some of those side effects of diabetes, kind of like the neuropathies, like the pins and needles coming into the feet, our skin doesn't heal as well, all of those type of things that come into play with diabetes. And no exception is that it affects the integrity of the vessels around the heart and can lead to heart disease. And so sometimes I think now when you have a diagnosis of diabetes, you are automatically put on heart medications. And that's because of the strong link between some of the mechanisms of diabetes and some of the things that are going on with heart disease. My lab is starting to cry because he says that it has been long enough that he has had to sit here and listen to me ramble on. And so he wants to go outside. Okay, so let's go and do kind of a recap. Heart disease, it is a thickening of a thickening of the lining around the vessels in the heart with something called atherosclerotic plaque. It causes a narrowing of the vessels around the heart. When there is a complete blockage, that is when a heart attack occurs. And so trying to prevent or stall the development of heart disease is super, super important. The risk factors that we went over, especially the ones that are in our control, are diet, exercise, managing our weight, smoking, too much alcohol, and too much stress. They often lead to the other risk factors, which are high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes. And all of these things work together. Going over those statistics again, 80% of premature heart attacks and strokes are preventable through healthy lifestyle choices. And 9 out of 10 Canadians have one of these risk factors. All right, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of food for thought. If you think that this might be you and you want to take the steps to get a little bit healthier with some of your diet or exercise choices, or quitting smoking or cutting down on your alcohol and need a little bit of help, reach out to somebody in your community. That can be a friend who can help keep you on track. That could be your doctor. That could be your physio. That could be your personal trainer. It could be someone in the fitness space, someone that you trust. Sometimes having that help can be hugely beneficial for any habit that you're trying to change. All right, that is it for today. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so. We would love it if you could give us a 5-star review, just so that we can get more people to check out the podcast and hear more about what we have to say, if you think that it's okay. With the show notes today, I'll put up some of the articles that we've done around heart disease and some of those FAQ videos on blood pressure that I was mentioning a little bit further on. I promise that Nick will be back next week. I think he will be back next week. I don't know if I'm going to be able to make that promise. I'm almost 100% sure. And we'll be talking a little bit more around some of the things around nutrition. Have an awesome week, everyone. And as always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@staveoff.ca. And I guess we will see you next week. All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you for listening to the Stave Off podcast. Go to staveoff.ca to check out the show notes and more helpful content and how you can lead a long and happy life. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Senior Rehab Project at seniorrehabproject.com.